By 1968, the United States Navy believed it had moved beyond battleships. Aircraft carriers projected power across the globe. Guided missiles promised accuracy at long range. Nuclear submarines operated unseen beneath the oceans. In that world, a ship built around massive guns seemed unnecessary. Battleships were expensive to operate. They required enormous crews. They were vulnerable to modern air power. For many naval planners, they represented a solved problem, a relic of an earlier era of warfare. So, when the Navy reactivated a World War II battleship for combat in Vietnam, the decision appeared to contradict decades of naval evolution. At the time, however, this decision was not seen as reckless. It was seen as reactivated and necessary. To understand why, it is not enough to look at the ship itself. You have to look at the problem the Navy was trying to solve. Vietnam was not a naval war in the traditional sense. There were no enemy fleets to hunt and no decisive sea battles to prepare for. Instead, the Navy found itself supporting a land war fought close to the coastline against an enemy that avoided fixed positions and exploited terrain. American and Allied ground forces frequently operated within a few miles of the sea. When those units came under heavy fire, naval support was often the fastest form of reinforcement available. In theory, aircraft were supposed to fill that role. In practice, the theory began to fail. North Vietnam built a dense and increasingly sophisticated air defense network. Surface-to-air missiles, radar-guided guns, and interceptor aircraft imposed real costs on every air mission. Weather further limited air operations, monsoon conditions, grounded aircraft, cloud cover reduced accuracy. Sortie rates could not always keep up with demand, especially during periods of intense fighting. Every request for air support also carried the risk of losing pilots. As aircraft losses mounted, pressure grew to find a form of fire support that did not rely on flying into contested airspace. The problem was not firepower, the problem was persistence. Aircraft arrived, delivered their ordnance, and left. What ground commanders needed was something that could stay on station, respond repeatedly, and operate regardless of weather or air defenses. That requirement quietly pointed backward in time. Modern missile ships existed, but they were built for a different mission. Missiles were expensive and carried in limited numbers. They were optimized for destroying ships or hardened targets, not for hours of sustained bombardment. Using missiles for routine fire support made little sense. Once expended, they could not be quickly replaced, and their cost far exceeded the value of many targets. Destroyers still carried guns, but their caliber and range limited their effect. They could harass enemy positions and suppress movement, but they could not dominate wide areas of coastline or reshape terrain. Naval planners were confronting a mismatch between modern naval doctrine and battlefield reality. Doctrine emphasized speed, precision, and technological advantage. Vietnam demanded endurance, volume, and reliability. That gap exposed a capability no new ship had been built to provide, but an old one still could. The battleship New Jersey had been placed in reserve after the Korean War. It was not scrapped. It was preserved. The ship represented an earlier design philosophy, centered on absorbing punishment and delivering sustained fire. Its heavy armor allowed it to operate close to hostile shores. Its guns offered range unmatched by conventional artillery. Its magazines carried thousands of shells, enabling continuous operations without immediate resupply. Most importantly, the ship was designed to fight for days at a time. Naval planners were not reviving it out of sentiment, they were accessing stored industrial capacity. This reflected a broader truth about military institutions. New technology does not always eliminate old capabilities. Sometimes it merely adds new ones, leaving older systems dormant rather than obsolete. Naval gunfire support had never disappeared from doctrine. It had only been deprioritized. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the centerpiece of naval strategy, but they did not fully replace them tactically. Air power could suppress targets, disrupt movement, and destroy infrastructure. What it could not always do was maintain continuous pressure over time. Battleships had been built to do exactly that. The Navy had assumed aircraft and missiles would eventually replicate this capability. Vietnam revealed the limits of that assumption. The engineering of New Jersey reflected those older priorities. The 16-inch guns were not precise by modern digital standards, but they were consistent and predictable. Mechanical fire control systems accounted for wind, ship movement, air density, and even the rotation of the Earth. Accuracy depended on forward observers on the battlefield rather than satellites or digital networks. This human-centered system proved well suited to Vietnam. Targets were often fleeting, coordinates changed rapidly, requests for fire support arrived with little warning. In that environment, responsiveness mattered more than theoretical precision. A battleship could respond within minutes. Missile ships could not sustain that tempo. Aircraft could not always reach the target in time. On the gun line, New Jersey became a persistent presence. It delivered fire missions day after day, shaping the battlefield in ways few other platforms could. It cleared terrain, suppressed enemy movement, and altered how both sides used coastal areas. For friendly forces, the ship represented reliability, support they could count on. For the enemy, it imposed constraints. Positions near the coast became dangerous, movement patterns changed, and psychological pressure mounted. But tactical effectiveness did not equal strategic flexibility. New Jersey required a crew of more than 1,000 sailors. Its operating costs were enormous. Fuel consumption, maintenance demands, and logistics placed constant strain on naval resources. The ship's usefulness was also geographically limited. It could only influence areas within gun range of the coastline. It could not shape the war inland. From a strategic perspective, it solved a narrow problem extremely well. It did not solve the war. By the late 1960s, the United States was reassessing its commitments. Defense budgets came under pressure. The Navy faced difficult choices about where to allocate resources. Operating a battleship for limited tactical benefit became harder to justify. The same qualities that made New Jersey effective also made it expensive. As air defenses evolved and new technologies matured, the assumptions that justified the ship's return weakened. The decision to deactivate New Jersey again was not a judgment on its performance, it was a judgment on priorities. Navies do not operate in a vacuum. They operate within political, economic, and strategic constraints. Reactivating New Jersey made sense because it was fast, available, and effective. It avoided additional pilot losses. It addressed an immediate operational gap. It was a rational response to time pressure rather than ideology. The assumption was not that battleships were the future. It was that nothing else could perform the same role at that moment. That distinction matters. The deployment of a World War II battleship in Vietnam was not nostalgia. It was institutional inertia, colliding with battlefield reality. The Navy had modernized unevenly. Some missions evolved faster than platforms, others outlasted doctrine. New Jersey did not fail because it was old, it was constrained because the system around it had changed. Warfare had become more dispersed, more political, and more constrained by cost. The battleship represented an older solution to a persistent problem. Its return exposed the limits of technological optimism. New tools do not automatically replace old ones. They changed the trade-offs. Vietnam made those trade-offs visible. Precision versus persistence, cost versus reliability, innovation versus endurance. New Jersey sat at the intersection of those tensions. This was not a failure of courage. It was not a failure of leadership. It was a failure of assumptions. And understanding those assumptions is essential to understanding naval warfare, not as a sequence of battles, but as a system of decisions. That is where Silent Fleet begins.